Like the word art, the term avant-garde is often used to mean weird, or non-mainstream. I find this use of the term irritating, because it turns it into a useless marketing word that is almost completely devoid of meaning. Avant-garde is a term borrowed from the military that means the vanguard, or a forward attack that supports the centre. In the context of art, it is used to categorize utopian or experimental works that attack conventional ideas from a belief in progress. Another term for this might be modernism. We are currently in the postmodern era, a time characterized by a collapsing of ideas, high and low, good and bad, conventional and avant-garde. Postmodernism seems to be a lot of things, but in short, postmodernism is the cultural logic of late capitalism. The avant-garde still exists in the postmodern era, but it's not clear whether such a term is relevant or useful. So what would we mean by an avant-garde video game? Well, to start, the stereotypes of an avant-garde video game would have to be quite different from avant-garde film. Film is the medium most people reach for when looking to compare video games with something else. It is, of course, rather different to video games, and its avant-garde is no exception. The main stereotype of the avant-garde film is visual abstraction. Abstract could describe the majority of video games made in the 1980s. Video games didn't start from naturalistic representation and move towards abstraction, quite the opposite. For a long time video games were, by necessity, if not abstract, then very stylized. This is why video games that call themselves art games look decidedly retro rather than shockingly new. That these games refer to themselves as art in this way is another reason why it's relevant to compare video games to film. The term art game comes directly from the term art film. This is where the terminology gets confusing because an art film is not the same as film art. Not at all. Art film is a vague term used to describe a film that is non-Hollywood, perhaps non-American, and perhaps has different concerns to Hollywood regarding plot, tone, look, acting, etc. Even with these loose definitions, it is used almost indiscriminately. Film art is art that uses film as its medium. It is this latter term that houses the avant-garde of film, and it is an art where I would feel compelled to place the avant-garde of video games. That is, I would say avant-garde video games were video games used as a medium by artists for art. The reason for this is not only that avant-garde is an art term, but because the concept of the avant-garde is explicitly political. Art tends to be more overtly political than other areas of culture. Video games, coming of age at the height of postmodernity, tend to pull that very postmodern pose of being apolitical. Of course, being apolitical is a political position. The term art game, like art film, seems to pose at being purely aesthetic. I find this too wishy-washy, and, with the knowledge that ignoring politics is political, too limited. When the most popular video game ever, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, is quite obviously political, it may be a good tactic for indie video games aiming for their idea of an avant-garde to embrace politics as an escape from mere retro aesthetics. I think of video games as being in a Hollywood moment, a moment that could quite conceivably last a long time. By Hollywood moment, I mean that right now, what video games most want to be like is Hollywood film. If you believe the big developers, the ultimate goal for video games is when you can't tell the difference. While this happened, and as a result of the technology becoming more accessible, indie games have risen as counterpoint. To move away from a comparison with film here, and to look at music, I think we could see video games as being where pop music was in the 80s. Technology was cheap enough that people could record at home, there was a dissatisfaction with the expensive mainstream, and a receptive audience that found the limited production values more appealing. Despite what I said above, I don't think all indie video games need to make a big deal about politics, and I still think that ultimately the medium is the message. Video games can come from an apolitical position if they choose, but I do think that some acknowledgement of politics is necessary to make indie video games seem relevant, rather than retro, in the same way that in the 80s, mainstream music pretended it was at the end of history, and independent music made the connection of music with politics explicit, and reached for shocking new forms in the process.